Quick example of the effects of natural selection on different species. Two very closely related gulls are Kittiwake gulls and herring gulls. Kittiwake gulls nest on steep cliffs with very deep nests so that there's very little chance that eggs will roll off the cliffs. What that means is predators can't easily reach those nests, and there's very likely no chance that your chick is going to end up in someone else's nest. On the other hand, herring gulls nest on flat, gravelly sand areas. Predators move freely through the herring gull colony. Nests have to be pretty non-obvious. And the main difference here is you'll see that herring gulls will chase off any neighboring chicks. That means if a scientist does what scientists do and they mess with the animals, and they go and take a chick from one nest and they put it in another nest, the herring gull will immediately recognize that that is not their offspring and chase it off. Kittiwake gulls, on the other hand, if you take a chick from a neighboring nest and put it in their nest, they will treat it like it's their own. And that is simply because there's no need for Kittiwake gulls to recognize their own offspring at that stage. The babies are not flying, they don't move, and therefore that trait doesn't exist. This is what's called an evolutionarily stable strategy, or an ESS. An evolutionary stable strategy is one in which a group of animals that adopt that strategy or a group of strategies, no other strategy can enter and be more successful. Okay, so the strategy is basically the set of behaviors that's available to an animal. Winning is that their fitness increases. Okay, so evolutionary stable strategy is the optimal strategy for an individual to follow when rewards depend on what others are doing. So the herring gulls and chicks is an ESS. Because they don't care for their neighboring chicks, well, it is an ESS because, let me back up and say, it's an ESS because there's no alternative behavior that would be more successful, especially given that environment. If they began caring for others' chicks, that would decrease their relative fitness because it would open the possibility that their own genetic offspring would be taken by predators. So there are pure ESSs, which are single strategies, and mixed ESSs, which are several strategies in a stable equilibrium. Sometimes one strategy will become more popular and sometimes another will, but they keep moving back and forth between those two. So remember that variation in individuals is the rule rather than the exception. Even in one litter of kittens, you'll have a large variety of coloration, for example. No offspring of the same parents are identical. Almost none, other than twins. Some differences are obvious, and others are very hard to detect. So some are easy to see, size or color pattern. Others are things like metabolic rate or ability to hear. And variants can be distinct or continuous. They can change gradually from one extreme to another. But most of the time, if you have a natural trait, they are distributed in a natural bell-shaped pattern, basically, the normal curve, where most individuals fall in between the extremes, but a few have the extremes. Remember that Darwin knew nothing about genetics. This was before the idea of genetics were born from Gregor Mendel. And Gregor Mendel was a monk who worked with pea plants, and he transferred pollen from some plants to others. For example, he took pollen from a purple plant and put it onto a white plant. And what he found was even mixing purple and white, you would end up with all purple offspring. So he began the modern study of genetics, and he defined some of the terms like gene, which is a basic unit of genetic information. The important thing to remember is that genes have no defined length. They are simply the amount of DNA that is required for a specific trait. So some genes are very long, thousands or even millions of protein pairs, and some are much shorter. A genome is the entire collection of genetic information. So, for example, the human genome tells us all of the genes that exist within the human species. Chromosomes are the individual storage unit of the genes. So, these X-shaped packets of tightly wound DNA are chromosomes, and different species have different numbers of chromosomes. So, we as humans have 23 pair of chromosomes when we've developed correctly. Other species have different numbers. And DNA is the nucleic acid that contains all of the genetic instructions. When I was little, they told us that these were basically like a recipe book, but we know now that it's much more complicated than that. That some genes simply exist to turn other genes on and off. Some are creating proteins that allow other genes to work, and a lot of times we just don't know what a lot of the genes do yet. Logical structure of a chromosome: if you spread out the DNA at certain areas on different chromosomes, you can find specific genes. That area is called the locus. That's the location. And the different types of genes that you can find in that location are called alleles. So we might have an allele for blue eyes versus an allele for brown eyes. Heritability is the part of variation in a trait that's attributed to genetics. And behavior is a product of both genes and environment that act on the genome. It's a very complicated structure where the environment will affect the genome by basically turning on some genes, turning off others, and then the genome will be more or less successful depending on both the genetic instruction and the environment that changes it. Measures of heritability vary from 0 to 1. It's simply a measurement of the variation in a population that can be traced to genetic material. One point to make is that genotypes are not phenotypes. So genotypes are what your genes say, and that's the key component of evolution. But evolution, natural selection, actually acts on the phenotype, and that's what's expressed and seen on the outside. So, for example, you know that different genes have dominant and recessive traits. So when Gregor Mendel mixed white pea plants and purple pea plants, he found that they all turned out purple. And that's because the purple gene was dominant over the white gene. Dominant traits lead to more phenotypes being expressed with the dominant trait than recessive traits do. Okay? So, it's another example. Fruit flies have a dominant gene for black eyes and a recessive gene for white eyes. So if you go down this list, you have a female with 2 black-eyed genes, and of course she's going to have black eyes. You then have a female with 1 black eye and 1 white eye gene, and she is going to have black eyes because black eyes are dominant. Next, you have a male who has a black eye gene, but the Y chromosome doesn't have that gene. This is called a sex-linked trait because in some cases there are not the genes on the Y chromosome at the same locus as there are on the X chromosome. So this is why, for example, male pattern baldness moves through the mother's line as opposed to the father's line, because you get your X chromosome from your mother, and the Y chromosome that you get from your father doesn't have that gene. That also means that any males who have been given the white eye gene in the fruit flies will express white eyes because there is no black eye, there's no option for a black eye dominant to overpower that. Dominants and recessives are found in all different species. So, for example, in cats, brown coloration is dominant over gray coloration. So even if the recessive is carried, it is not going to be expressed in the individual. Only when there are 2 recessives will it be expressed. Now, an interesting way to think about this is it tells us a lot of why some non-adaptive traits might be passed through the species line. For example, the gene for sickle cell anemia is a recessive gene, but that gene also confers, even when recessive, even when paired with a dominant gene for regular blood cells, the recessive trait of sickle cell anemia protects against malaria. So that means if you actually draw the quadrangle and you have two dominant blood types for normal blood cells, that individual is more likely to contract malaria and die. If you have two recessive genes, that means that that individual is likely to get sickle cell anemia and will probably also die. But the two in the corners, which have one dominant and one recessive gene, means that they're protected from malaria and they have normal blood cells. And therefore, they pass on the sickle cell anemia gene because it provides protection as well as only in recessive cases is it problematic. Phenotypic variation has three sources: genetic variation, the environment, and learning. Only two of these matter at all, right? Learning is internal change, and natural selection cannot act directly on learning. However, it can act on the probability of being able to learn. Individuals who learn faster might survive better, for example. Genetic variation is the most important thing. Natural selection acts on recessive traits only when they're in homozygous individuals because the trait has to be expressed. And in the environment, some genes are expressed differentially depending on environmental factors, and that might modify other genes, which means that the trait may or may not be visible as a phenotype, and natural selection can act on the phenotype.